Welcome to the Irish Occupational Therapy podcast, hosted by me, Jen Trzeciak,
and me, Aideen Ruttledge.
This podcast is dedicated to exploring the world of occupational therapy, sharing the latest research and techniques and providing insights into the many ways that occupational therapy can help people of all ages live more fulfilling and meaningful lives.
Whether you are a practicing occupational therapist, a student of occupational therapy, or simply curious about this fascinating field, this podcast is for you. We'll be interviewing experts in the field, sharing stories from the front lines of occupational therapy practice, and providing tips and advice for anyone looking to get the most out of their therapy.
So sit back, relax, and join us on this exciting journey into the world of occupational therapy in Ireland.
Today on the podcast, we're hoping to have a little bit less blushing and a little bit more talk about sex, bodies, puberty, and what our role is with all of this as occupational therapists. We welcome Sarah Sproule, OT and sex educator who has a passion to ensure every parent and caring adult knows how to nurture deeper connection with their growing kids. You're very welcome, Sarah.
Great to be here, Aideen. Thanks so much for the invitation.
Sarah, could we start off with the sex educator bit? Because I suppose most of our audience are occupational therapists, and we're just interested in how you became passionate about this area and your journey to date.
You know, maybe it's like other OTs. When I finished my OT degree, I wasn't really sure where I was going to take it because OT is so broad. And for a while, I worked in acute physical, doing discharge planning. And as my OT career went on and I had my own children, it was sort of a fusion between what I wanted for my growing kids and the experience I'd had growing up. Because when I grew up, I didn't feel like I could ask questions of my caring adults, my parents. And that didn't mean that they weren't there for me. They loved me very much and they would happily have told me lots of things. My mum was a nurse, but there something had been missed or was missing. And so, for example, when I got my first period, even though mum had had a conversation with me about that before, I discovered that this was happening when I was in the bathroom one day, and I was so embarrassed that I didn't want to tell anyone about it. So I sort of stuffed toilet paper in my undies and just like hoped for the best. I wanted to hide it. And if anyone else here has a period, you will know that toilet paper is not very effective when it comes to like soaking up all the fluid that happens. So I eventually had to go and speak to her, and she was great about it. But it's an indicator to me that something was missing in the connection that I had with my parents. And so that's where it all began. I did my master's in sexuality studies, blended that with my OT skills, and came out with sort of a model of the things that are needed to build this connection, particularly around sensitive conversations related to sex.
And then with your career path, do you find that that's better suited to private practice, or is there any roles within the public sector that you've been involved in?
Because of the way my family life has been, I have always been in private practice with my sex education, but that's just because it's easier for me. I know that, expressing our sexuality is an activity that we do as humans. So it forms perfectly into OT practice in all areas, right? I would probably say my practice is more psychosocial now. I'm focused more on neurodivergent children and families, but equally you would know yourself in the rehab environments, there's a really important place for conversations about sex, because education is not just about young people, is it? We all can benefit from education related to our sexuality because we're constantly changing through our lifespan. Like I'm deep in the menopause right now, and that has changed the way my sexuality expresses itself. When we have children, whether we are birthing them with our own body or we are parenting them in another way, that changes the way we can express our sexuality. There's so many different factors in it. So it's absolutely part of everyday existing and activities of daily living.
Occupations.
That's exactly it.
And I remember hearing you at conference, Sarah, and it was so refreshing to hear somebody talking so openly about sex and sexuality, because I know when I trained 25 years ago now, there was an element of it. It was like, yeah, you should talk about sex. There is this thing called sex. And occasionally it would come in if the client brought it up. Very rarely would I have the courage to kind of bring it up into a conversation. And, you know, I completely understand that kind of gap, you know, as a growing up in Catholic Ireland, a lot of shame, a lot of guilt. And now I don't want to pass that on. I do talk about it more with my young people, but I'm finding as a parent of two teenagers, actually those conversations can be really tricky and uncomfortable. How can we become more comfortable? How can we have those conversations or approach those conversations with young people?
Yeah, and do you know what was interesting? When you invited me to do this and you specifically focusing on teens, I always find this conversation, the one focused on teens, to be really like, it needs to be done very gently. I mean, I know this is a podcast, but I'm touching my heart here because the important thing to say, first of all, is that the earlier we start conversations about this part of being human, having a sexual self, our genitals, the easier it's going to be for everyone involved. And in the sexuality sort of education best practice, that would mean that you're talking to children from around the ages of 2 and even earlier about their genitals, all of their body, teaching consent principles. Children from the age of 6 and sometimes earlier should know, be able to sort of understand the concepts of conception and how sperms and eggs get together in those 3 different ways, right? So when we're coming to teens, if a family is coming to me and saying, oh, everything's awkward now, my first port of call is, what were the conversations like earlier on? And for some of us, we don't have a time machine and we can't go back, right? And we just accept that and we bring in a lot of self-compassion. So if that is the case, then it is very much about channeling this idea of consent within our family, right? So we're holding 2 competing truths, so to speak, that we know that our teen needs accurate, shame-free, panic-free information about sexuality, their body, consent, the culture. And the other truth is that, and I hope you don't mind me swearing, that's part of the culture of the way I work and the culture of, the people I work with. There's no fucking way they're going to want to hear that from us. There's just these 2 irrefutable, immutable, like rocks clashing against each other like this. So we need to take a step back and go, okay, what is actually the big picture here? And the big picture is we want to be their go-to person. We want to be the person they come to when there's a crisis. So how do we demonstrate that we can be that adult for them? And it's by showing deep respect for who they are and what their boundaries are. Now, this is a really long answer, Jen. And if that's okay with you, I'm going to keep going with it, because the reason is, if we try and say, look, you need to know about STIs, for example, or consent, we need to have this conversation, and then you get into an argument or a fight, what that's done is it's reduced the connection, right? It's reduced your young person's trust in you. If we can instead start the conversation with, look, I need to apologize to you. I've messed up here. I did not know when you were really small that you and I could have started to have conversations about all sorts of things related to bodies and boundaries. I didn't know that. And so what happened is we didn't develop an easygoing way to chat. And that's my fault. And I'm here to make things right? And then hand it over to them, say, look, you need accurate information, but I want to respect your boundaries. So can you have a think about some of the ways that you would feel comfortable getting the information that we both know you need. And then you just leave it. Right? Now, I've sort of role played that conversation, but as anyone who has a teen will know, it won't go like that. They'll effing blind maybe, and they'll slam the door like I did. Yeah, exactly, right. I did that. Mum came in for the period conversation. I get out of my room, slam the door, and like we didn't really talk about it again. But the underlying thread here is that we are, rather than educating through words and information, we're educating through creating a dynamic of respect and consent.
Yeah. And you're opening the door to that conversation, even if it doesn't happen there and then. You're saying, I'm okay to have this when you're ready to have it.
Yeah, that's right. And almost to, not only am I okay to have this, it's important. Mm-hmm. And because we haven't had it earlier, that's on me. That part is really important, to claim responsibility, right? Because what it does is it shifts the power hierarchy in a parent-young person relationship, which is oftentimes the parent knows best and you need to be home at a certain time and have you done your homework. When we shift that and do it differently, which is like, this is on me, I mucked up, I'm really sorry. Sometimes it can give our young person a bit of a pause and go, oh, you can sort of see it in their face. What? Shit, they made a mistake and they're actually owning it. That's not a bad thing, you know.
It's a reset. I love that answer.
I can keep talking and talking, but you really, you know that I'm ADHD and autistic, right? So, and you've got me talking about my special interest. If you don't channel me, I am just going to go for half an hour, and then we're going to say, okay, bye.
Aideen's go on.
Sarah, can you share with us some of the misconceptions, particularly within our culture in Ireland, around this topic? And I suppose some of us parents that have messed up and haven't had that conversation early enough on, what do you see then as the consequences of that? So the misconceptions that some of our teenagers have. We've mentioned shame and guilt. Anything else that you see commonly?
Can we get graphic here? There's no point beating around the bush with things like this. So it's going to be, if we haven't consciously demonstrated that sexuality is part of who we know we all are as humans, and that we accept everyone's sort of diversity in our home. So there are all sorts of diversities, you know, our neurodiversity, our the diversity related to our gender, the diversity related to our who we're attracted to, diversity in whether we have intimate relationships where we share our body or not, diversity in whether we have children or not, diversity in whether we have accidental pregnancies. There's just so much diversity in the world of sexuality and relationships. So one of the challenges will be, as our young person grows into who they are, if they haven't had a really clear, we accept everyone for who they are sort of message, then they may tend to sort of keep things back. Now, teenagers are developmentally meant to do that anyway. Like, I don't know, well, maybe some neurodivergent teenagers who like share every little thing with a parent or a guardian will speak openly, but it's developmentally appropriate for a teenager to sort of draw back. So if they are following their developmental sort of age, but also they've had that modeling of things not being spoken about, like introduced with their adults, then it's going to be more likely they're going to hide away. So that will mean things like, if they do have their sexual debut, for example, that it might end up happening in a car or behind a shed, which is not ideal in terms of physical safety, access to methods of STI reduction, pregnancy prevention, those sort of things. The other thing I will say is, just because we haven't started a conversation early doesn't mean we can't, right? So there are things we can do in our home that start sending this message. So, for example, you could find some podcasts that you like that are related to sex or relationships, even menopause, if that's something that is relevant in your life, or if a family has experienced secondary infertility, if you have a friend who is creating their family through surrogacy. All these are resources to bring conversations into our home or into like neutral spaces that isn't directed at a teen. So I don't know if you remember, but I certainly have had experiences when I was growing up where I could hear my mum talking to her sister in the kitchen. Oh, what's that about? And at that time it was cervical smears. Didn't even know what a cervix was. I was like, what's going on there? What are they talking about? Right? You can put up posters. There's this really great poster I have. I can't remember what it's called. It's by Hazel Mead, and it's the things you don't see in porn. And it's got all these different things like bra lines and sweat and period sex and consent, disability, people getting tired and having breaks. So there are things environmentally, right? Here we are, we're having the OT conversation, that we can bring into our young person's environment that starts sending them signals. Even a book on the bookshelf, like I brought a few here. Hang on, let me just reach down to get this. So like, for example, this is a really good book. Can We Talk About Consent? It's by Justin Hancock, who is an amazing sex educator in the UK. If you had a book like that, even on your family bookshelf, if we still have bookshelves, everything's Kindle and things
or
now.
Kindle,
but,
yeah.
Right? Yeah. But these sending signals, the earlier you can do this, the better off it's going to be. In fact, it's almost like if you were creating these changes in your home before you even said to your teen, "Oh, I'm sorry about this." So you're just non-verbally starting to change an environment. And then you might say, "Look, I'm really sorry. I've realized that I mucked up. I'm starting to buy some books. I've got a poster, blah, blah, blah." Here's one, Let's Talk About It by Erica Moyen and Matthew Nolan. And this is a graphic novel. Like, remember that what we're trying to do is enter our young person's world. And rather than get them to come over to our world. So what are the ways that they interact with information the easiest? Maybe that's by sending them Instagram reels of a sex educator that Scarlet Teen is a website that just has the most amazing information on it. They do not pull their punches when it comes to the complexities of teen sexuality. And I suppose here's one misconception to get back to that question, that if we talk about stuff to our teen, they'll go out and experiment, right? And so parents will be less likely to maybe talk about gender identity, or less likely to talk about like consent violations or a unplanned pregnancy. And so when we as adults don't model what those conversations look like, our kid is less likely to be able to bring them up, right? And when children and young people have accurate, shame-free information, it doesn't mean they go out and explore. It means they have information for when life experience comes down the road to them.
Because it's going to happen anyway, yeah.
That's right.
You've got a great Instagram page. I know you're not on social media at the moment all the time, but one of the resources that you have is you go through lots of different books, which is I found really helpful, and kind of just getting some recommendations from an expert was really, really valuable. I can see the value of having those in your home environment, but also potentially in a clinic, as OTs, having that kind of signal that actually we are really open to conversations about this. In terms of occupational therapy, what role do you feel that we do play, or we should play, in terms of sex and sexuality and helping young people to navigate and express or understand their experience?
Yeah. That's a great question. See, I suppose like any OT, I'm going to be looking at the different components of a human with their sexuality, right? And when I think about it, okay, first of all, there's that, I can never remember this word, that word that talks about our ability to go inside and notice our sensations and be able to, there we go, thank you very much. Word finding difficulties over here. So the base skills of how does someone live in their sexual self, right? So interoception is one of them, our ability to communicate, the emotional regulation when it comes to embarrassment, how do we ask for what we need? How does our young person ask for what they need in an intimate relationship perhaps? How do they hear a no or a yes or a maybe? What about nonverbal communication, right? Like all the different little facets of being sexual with another person. And then there is all the things about discovering our sexual self for ourselves. That's a really important developmental stage. If a family hasn't had conversations about self-pleasure, for example, or masturbation, that our genitals are our own, and our job, in a sense, as we develop, is to understand our genitals and work out how they feel pleasure, right? What sort of touch do they like, if any? Is there any sort of imaginings or dreams that we might have that make us feel excited? What does arousal feel like? So I'm talking about these components, and you would offer that perhaps in a mental health setting, in a neurodivergent setting, in a setting where there has been family breakdown or trauma. As OTs, we also have a role in the family dynamic, and that's where I mainly do most of my work. So if parents are coming to me and saying, look, oftentimes it will be things like, my child can't keep their hand out of their pants. They're always touching their penis or their vulva, or they start rubbing their genitals against the sofa whenever we're trying to get ready for school. That's a huge OT role there in terms of, well, what is the intersection between a child's a way they're managing their sensory world and how they might be sensory seeking or sensory avoiding, and the family dynamic to do with, shame. Because if a child is doing something with their genitals and come to an OT, it's a whole different thing than if a child is like picking their face or their teeth or chewing their nails and come to an OT, right? Mm-hmm. We don't have just a role in the sensory part of that. We have a role in terms of being able to unpick the stigma and really look at that as therapists. And I will say that it's our job, first of all, to do that for ourselves. So as you're listening to me give you that scenario, what comes up for you as a therapist? Like, is there a feeling of confidence of, oh yeah, I could do that? Or is there a feeling of, whoa?
My stomach is going, oh God.
Yeah, right?
It's a difficult conversation, yeah.
It really is. So this is where we can be kind to ourselves and be really understanding that, like, oh, hang on a minute. This part of working with humans, it's not neutral. It's not like working in orthopedics or I don't know, some other cardiology. It's not like that. We aren't all raised with stigma and shame about our heart or our bones. Mm-hmm. But a lot of us are raised with stigma and shame about our genitals and our sexuality. So it's really important that as OTs that we don't deny our personal challenge around this. And this is a little bit of the work that I'm getting into now, like supervision around that specific concern. So if a therapist has a client that comes in and they can feel inside themselves there's the ick, that is a really good sign to reach out and say, maybe even just have one session, come and have a chat about, okay, what was going on in what are you afraid will happen if a conversation about sexuality is in your clinic? Whether it's with a parent or a teen or whatever, because the more you can be open and courageous and seek help for things like that, the more able you're going to be in your clinical work. And there is a lot to be said about getting that satisfaction of like, fuck yeah, I did that. I helped that family. That was not an easy thing. Look at me go. That's a really nice feeling to have, as I'm sure we all know in lots of different areas of our practice.
That's really important, Sarah, like really to take that time to work on ourselves so that we can offer that. I've related to that recently. I did a training for a special school on supporting autistic children as their body changes during puberty. Could we touch a little bit on that, on intellectual disability and how we can make all this information accessible? I go very visual and try and make it very, I suppose, attention grabbing and interesting. I noticed some of the books that you had there had lovely visual material, lots of graphics. Any other suggestions or any particular resources?
While I work with ADHD and autistic families, I'll be working through the parent to the child, right? So I've got a family at the moment. Little boy is, I think he's 5. So because I'm working through the parents, it would be slightly different. But I will encourage things like getting resources around the house, playfulness. If a child is showing interest, like taking the interest that they have and making it fun. It's like things like, I can see you're doing penis time. That's excellent. We can tick that off the list. We don't need to worry about that part of learning anymore. Next, we're going to get to times tables or something like that. So it's really about the lightness that we bring to it. In the same way that we educate young people with particular educational needs about anything at all, it's the same thing. It's exactly the same thing, right? Aideen, so like the educational resources around that group that you were dealing with would have had lots of go-to strategies for teaching them absolutely anything at all. Exactly the same thing here. The only difference is that stigma piece, that sort of like giggly, embarrassing piece. They might have had that. Though I notice that the children and young people in my neurodivergent world are so sort of almost starved of detail. Oftentimes the thing will be like, if there's been a sort of a supposedly behavioral problem, oftentimes that will be because the adults around that young person fudging the details, constantly fudging the details. And that young person's behavior is, they're trying to answer their own questions. And that results in consent violations. So what I would say is more. And when you think you've done enough, you do double. You do triple. You keep bringing it up. That is the most important thing. The mantra in sex education is early and often.
In terms of young people exploring their sexual orientation, or maybe uncertainty around that, how do we support them in that journey? Do we need to support them? Will they just figure it out themselves?
That's a great question. So in this, we can start talking about culture now, which is one of my special interests. So no human grows up in a vacuum. We all grow up in a culture, either the culture of a family or the culture of a city or a country or a minority group in a different environment, right? And one of the things that is still happening is that this idea of heteronormativity. So most humans in Ireland anyway, unless they're very lucky, grow up in a heteronormative culture. It's much better than it was 20 years ago. But a lot of the children's books and things don't show diversity in relationships and family. So because of that, we need to, as adults, be really clear that we are transmitting a message of acceptance. So whether that is in your clinic setting, using rainbow symbols around the place. And I would caution, you don't just put a rainbow symbol there and think you're doing the work. Like, you need to be able to follow that up with a true capacity to be awesome around queer kids, right? And so that's another piece of work we can do as therapists ourselves. Like, I'm a bisexual, gender, sort of queer therapist, so I suppose I have an advantage in that. And even so, I have misgendered queer clients. I do it. And there's a whole thing around that. Well, how do we own that? What do we do about that? How do we take care of our client? How do we look after ourselves in situations like that? So as parents and as clinicians, our job is to send explicit messages of acceptance for all sorts. So you can do that by, if you're watching a movie or something, you're saying, God, what? There isn't a lot of like single parent families portrayed in this show, or why is everyone married, or why is everyone talking behind that person's back because they're gay? Like, just simply calling out these things. And if this is in the home environment, our teen is going to go, ugh, roll their eyes, go, oh, mom. But the thing is, there's these little pieces of information, they make a difference. even going so far as not assuming they'll get married. Like, if you ever have a partner one day, if you decide to have kids and maybe you won't, all those, like, always qualifying, trying to the best of our ability to never assume.
I always had to pick up grandparents on that when they would say, "Oh, your boyfriend." I was like, "Boyfriend or girlfriend?" And trying to kind of say, that we're open and not go down that kind of stereotypical route. But it takes a lot of effort to keep pulling people up. But it does seem like there's a lot more representation on TV these days, and I wonder whether generationally things are just getting a little bit easier, and kids aren't kind of questioning as much as we might have done, or they're just more au fait with the idea of
think they
non-traditional families.
I think they are. And also, in families, though, we still need to demonstrate. We still need to say, because a parent is a whole nother human when it comes to coming out about anything. Coming out about failing a spelling test is much easier to talk about with a friend than to come home and tell a parent, right? Mm-hmm. It's the same thing related if you're realizing you're gender neutral or you're bi or queer or whatever it is, that it's different because parents we have like, there's a heaviness to our responses. There's a lot of meaning placed around them. And so as clinicians, then going back to OTs, it may be that if you're sort of displaying and portraying a really affirming, queer affirming space, that a client may very well come out in some small ways to you in your clinic. Kids certainly do for me. If I'm in the classroom doing the sex ed, I have a really old tatty rainbow bag that I got from Tiger years ago that I will carry some of my stuff in. And it's just one of those little like cues. And I've had like, sometimes it's the nerdiest kid in the room, sometimes it's the coolest kid in the room come up to me and say, "Like your rainbow bag?" And I'll go, "Yep, rainbows are the thing," right? And it's just that little moment where they're showing who they are, and I get to accept it and sort of mirror it back with joy.
Lovely. Sarah, can we talk a little bit more about your work? I just find it really interesting, all the different strands. You do sex education in school. You work directly with parents. You also do some corporate work as well.
Yep, that's right. There's a number of strands. Like I'm not taking any new schools because I think it's probably because I'm just going to keep talking about menopause because I'm deep in the menopause. My energy is not what it once was. So I just have the schools that I have, but I'll absolutely talk to parent groups in schools. I do a talk called, I can't even remember what it is now, but it's basically about this, a lot of what we've talked about here, but in more detail, specifically around in primary schools. How do we create these cultures in our home so that when relationship and sex ed is happening in school, that's not the first time your kid has heard about things. I do like clinical supervision for clinicians who may be queer themselves and are like finding it like, how do I use my true self, all of myself? I do that same work for neurodivergent clinicians, parents, again, those situations that I've talked about, and starting to work with sort of 16-year-olds and up. And while my work has always been about sexuality, it seems to be transitioning more into neurodivergence. And the reason I've realized is because things related to sex and communication and neurodivergence, they're like two peas in a pod. And I think I've probably always worked with neurodivergent people, but just didn't realize it because I was undiagnosed and I was coming to it from the sexuality perspective, because that was personally what I had problems with growing up. Like, how do I advocate for myself? How do I speak up? How do I even answer someone if they ask me to go out with them and I don't know what to say? All that awkwardness. And so my work is diverse, but essentially the thread that runs through it is diversity, conversations that are really difficult, minority identities, and discovering joy in learning to be who we really are in the world. And it's pretty good.
In having those conversations, Sarah, I imagine you need to stay very regulated yourself. Is there anything that you find helps you in terms of your own regulation in approaching those conversations?
Yeah, absolutely. So So I have done some training in mindful self-compassion with Kirsten Neff and the other guy, his name I can't remember, Christopher, what's his name? Obviously polyvagal trained. I have done, I'm trained in internal family systems, which basically means that I focus on people and myself. This is why I use it really on myself as being parts. I've got lots of different little parts of myself. So I've learned how to take care of the part of me that is embarrassed, for example, that I had to open this fizzy water while I was on a podcast with you and take care of that part so I can continue my work, right? Or the part of me that experienced, I have a trauma history, right? So that's another thing I do. I do my own therapy, go to my therapist, do all my somatic stuff so that to the best of my ability, those life experiences I've had are transmuted into something powerful, something that is almost like, it's like a demonstration that my client or my people in my classroom, they're not broken for whatever's happened in their life, I've learnt to wholeheartedly believe in my own and other people's ability to heal with the right support, right? And I think there's something about that has really helped me. Like, it's reduced my need for perfectionism. I don't know if that's an OT-wide thing about being perfect in work, but that was a big part of taking care of myself, so that in a clinical environment that I'm not having to like deal with my perfectionism over here while my client is in front of me, because no human can be dealing with two fronts like that. So it really is a lot about my own personal care, my therapy, ensuring that my caseload is not too big. I know a lot of us don't have control over that, but if at all possible, really notice what my body is telling me about how much work is enough work. It's practice for me. It's not something that I've done. It's an ongoing journey. That process. That's exactly it.
Great answer.
Yeah.
And I'm going to jump in there and highlight AOTI. I don't always do this, but if you're part of AOTI, you can access counselling support. And, for any OT, it's worth going through your own process and understanding yourself fully. And if you can't afford to do that privately, use the resources, employee assistance programs. You get 6 or 8 free sessions. Why not use that to work through some of this stuff yourself? Sorry, little effort in there.
Yeah, and in
but
fact,
I think it's worth accessing.
Absolutely, I'm a member of AOTI, and that's really important for me actually as a solo practitioner, because otherwise I don't have that OT community, and I mean, that's another thing about my own regulation. Surrounding myself by people who work privately, if OTs, who understand sort of the complexities of things. If they're not working in sexuality, I find other clinicians that are working in sexuality, because we can't work as islands. Whatever work we're doing, it doesn't have to be sex. We need our people around us. And the AOTI is really great for that sort of thing. Like, they've got a really great sex and gender special interest group. So 100% agree with that AOTI shout out. Yes.
Sarah, thank you very much for paving the way, first of all, for us OTs in this area. You're doing an amazing job. All of your social media pages, your websites, so much information, really, really helpful for those of us as well that don't solely work in this area, but dabble with it from time to time. It's really amazing. Thank you for sharing all of your insights today and for joining us on the Irish OT podcast.
You're so welcome. It was an honour.
That's all for today's episode on the Irish Occupational Therapy podcast. We hope you enjoyed our discussion and found it informative and engaging. If you've any questions or comments, we would love to hear from you. You can email us at irishotpodcast@gmail.com or connect on Instagram or Facebook.
And remember to subscribe to our podcast so that you never miss an episode. If you found this episode helpful, please leave us a review on your preferred podcast platform. Your feedback is important and helps us to improve the show, so please do leave it. Thank you for listening to the Irish Occupational Therapy podcast, hosted by myself, Jen Trzeciak.
And myself, Aideen Ruttledge.
We look forward to sharing more insights and knowledge with you in future episodes. Until then, take care.